Chapter 33. The Needs Never End. It was with amazingly light hearts we were able to take a 6-month sabbatical after Charles took over. We visited our daughter and family in Canada, saw many relatives and friends in Southern California. There were lots of reunions, including a very happy time with American MAF. There was no need for the mini office that had dogged our steps on every other leave. We were entirely free to visit and spend time seeking God's leading and blessing on the days ahead. By 1987, I had completed 40 years with MAF, and it felt good to see God's hand as others carried on the work so ably. What were the future years to hold for MAF Europe? Would its main task be to consolidate and extend the services it was already developing in countries like Tanzania? Would we continue to watch and wait for opportunities to return to countries we had served in the past, like the Sudan and Ethiopia? Might we be called upon to enter new areas in Africa, or even beyond? That very year, 1987, a new MAF program started in Uganda. Uganda was once called the Pearl of Africa. When we first knew it, with its well-ordered towns, its quiet villages, neat farmsteads, beautiful trees and banana plantations, it had seemed a delightful land. In those earlier days, it had some of the best roads in Africa. Moreover, God had blessed its people with a sustained spiritual revival. It had little need of our services. Since then, what horrors had swept across that beautiful country and its people. Its beauties had been drenched with blood, its tranquility turned to terror. The Pearl of Africa had become a pit of atrocities. Few families were left unscathed during the 15 years of Amin's dictatorship. 1 in 10 Ugandans, princes and paupers alike, met a violent death at the hands of government agents. The economy was devastated, education deteriorated, medical care suffered, and the country was reduced to total chaos. Not until Yoweri Museveni became president in 1986 did the nation edge back towards recovery and stability. But there was still a long way to go. The previously beautiful roads were ruined. Churches, missions, hospitals and aid projects were isolated. Across the north of the country, bandit ambushes were leaving many dead. Vehicles and equipment were being hijacked. Without a plane, much of the badly needed relief and development work was impossible. At this point, church leaders in Uganda asked MAF to become partners in the huge task of rehabilitation. Gad Gasatura, a Ugandan pilot, had been flying with MAF US in Zaire. They lent him to us to establish an office in Uganda's capital, Kampala, and he was soon flying from the international airport at Entebbe. The base there became a hub of communications for churches, Christian work, and aid projects. 2 years later, Gad, already co-pastor in a vibrant Kampala church, also became a member of the Ugandan parliament and left MAF. But the work continued to grow, carried on by other MAF pilots, engineers, administrators, and their families. The flight routes radiating from Entebbe reached the peripheries of the country and beyond. Thousands of southern Sudanese refugees, fleeing from the famine and civil war in their own country, crossed the border into neighbouring Zaire. They were in a pitiful condition, dulled by misery and sickness. Our Uganda-based MAF pilots flew emergency medical teams and urgently needed vaccines to halt epidemics amongst them. Housing, water supplies and dispensaries followed. Now they could start growing food for themselves. Their eyes, instead of showing despair, shone with hope. We were even able to fly doctors over the usually closed borders into southwest Sudan itself to care for those still there. Within Uganda, Pastors and evangelists used MAF services to keep in touch with large and otherwise inaccessible areas. Church-based agricultural programs were made possible. Desperately needed AIDS, care and control programs were taken much further afield than would otherwise have been feasible. Hospitals were reopened, eye treatment safaris inaugurated, epidemics checked. "We would be hard-pressed to stay if MAF did not come," said one community health doctor. "We would have either to risk our lives trying to make trips to the capital or stay without supplies and achieve very little." Nowhere, up to now, had MAF been so used in rehabilitating a whole country as it had in Uganda. In 1989, Seppo Kurkala attended a mission conference in his home country of Finland. There he met an African, Bishop Dumeni, leader of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Namibia. The bishop was interested to hear of MAF and later wrote to Charles Wilson, asking whether he would be prepared to start work in his country. Charles promptly replied that he'd gladly arrange a further survey as soon as possible. Namibia had been on our minds since the early 1970s, and Gordon Marshall, soon after his return to South Africa, had carried out our first survey there. For years the tense struggle for independence had inhibited any service, but at last guerrilla warfare had ended and self-government had come. 42,000 refugee Namibians had returned to their country. In the aftermath of the fighting, thousands of displaced people, many of them Christians, needed spiritual and physical assistance. There was both the need for help and the opportunity to give it. Max Gove and Seppo Kurkala made a fresh survey. They found the country largely desert, except in the north, where 70% of the people lived. Development had been held back during the many years of fighting. Now, with the area open, new schools, clinics and farming projects were being planned. Their construction and supervision required extensive travel. Though there were commercial air services, they couldn't reach the wide variety of remote places where churches, missions and development agencies wanted to go. Andy Stratton was a pilot and engineer who'd already had wide experience with MAF in Africa. Early in 1991, he and his wife Margaret established a program headquarters at Windhoek, Namibia's capital and government centre. By the middle of 1991, a Swiss couple, the Diethelms, were operating effectively in the heavily populated northern region using a Cessna 210. "This couple are real missionaries," remarked Bishop Dumeni's church secretary. "They don't only fly, they speak of their faith." The work in Namibia, however, proved to be of fairly short duration for us. After 4 years, the flying had reduced significantly. MAF Canada, who were already working close by in Angola, took over our Windhoek base at the end of 1995. Because of the nature of work in Africa and other areas, today we have to be as flexible as possible in meeting needs. Some of these may be temporary, others very long-term. An operation outside Africa? So far, we'd concentrated entirely on work within the great continent to which we'd first been drawn 40 years before. But for some time, there had been inquiries from further afield. As early as 1974, our people in South Africa had told us about the travel needs in Madagascar, that large and beautiful tropical island 300 miles to the southeast in the Indian Ocean. Madagascar is an island nearly 1,000 miles long from north to south, with a backbone of high forested plateau running all the way down its eastern side, which hampers journeys between east and west. There are travel difficulties between north and south too. They are increased by the many rivers which cut across the width of the country. In the south, there are some all-weather routes, but the few northern roads that exist are very poor. the region can be completely cut off for months at a time in the rainy season. We learned that Air Madagascar flew to some 50 airstrips, but this still left many places unreached. It was also hard to get seats on planes. Christian workers wasted much time and energy in tedious travel. For more than a decade, the rise of Marxism in Madagascar prevented us from going in to help. By 1988, however, that influence had waned, and with the backing of the churches there, we were permitted to launch an air service. With characteristic speed, the Urier family arrived within a few weeks of permission being granted. The aircraft chosen for Madagascar was an Italian Partenavia, particularly suited to the long-distance needs of the country. Its twin engines were calculated to give additional safety over the extremely rugged mountain and river terrain. But, once again, a new venture was to start with disaster. During the plane's very first flight over the mountainous east coast, both engines failed. Maurice crash-landed in a bamboo swamp on a hillside. He was injured, so was one of his missionary passengers, even more seriously. Much worse, the injured missionary's 5-year-old daughter was killed. Our subsequent investigation showed there'd been fuel starvation to both engines. Church leaders in Madagascar, far from being deterred, encouraged Maurice not to give up. The bereaved missionary family faced their loss with great courage, confident that God would still bring good out of this tragedy. Our supporters were not deterred either. Within a month, their gifts enabled a new Partenavia to be purchased. After some weeks, Maurice recovered sufficiently to resume the service. Since then, the work in Madagascar has grown, though the potential has still to be fully realized. Church-rural outreach, medical work, agricultural schemes and water projects are all candidates for help. Many remote villages, still accessible only on foot, need medical help and the chance to hear and see God's love. We believe that this program, having started with tragedy, will go on to see the triumph of all its hopes to the glory of God. From the time he'd first found his way to our London office, Max Gove had believed God was calling him into MAF. He'd followed that call with enthusiasm and determination. He had now gained 20 years' extensive flying and leadership experience. In 1991, Max was appointed Chief Executive of MAF Europe. Charles Wilson became Executive Vice Chairman of the Board. Max's former post of Director of Overseas Operations went to David Marfleet, our ex-Army Air Corps helicopter pilot, who'd just completed 8 years on loan to MAF US in Indonesia. Others who'd worked with MAF for many years had also now been in management positions for some time. God had continued to provide and prepare the next generation to carry on the work he had started. The future wouldn't always be easy, any more than the past had been, but I was sure that the one who had called and led us through all our own time in MAF would just as surely lead them and enable them to meet the challenges ahead. Tales of Kublai Khan and the great Mongolian Empire stretching from China to Hungary always fascinated me. I had to learn Coleridge's fantasy poem as a schoolboy. In Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. Nowadays, Mongolia's mountains and deserts have few roads and only one railway line to serve their sparse populations. To get to hospital, many still have to ride horses. It can take a week. A British missionary, John Gibbons, with his wife Altar, one of the first Mongolian Christians, were requested by the Mongolian Ministry of Health to get help for the country's medical needs. John knew that any effective medical program would need aircraft. He contacted Charles and Max. To fly out to Mongolia was one of Max's first challenges as chief executive. Seppo and David Cormack went with him to Ulaanbaatar to meet John and visit officials of the Ministry of Health and Civil Aviation. They also wanted to see something of the country itself. It was clear that if MAF established a service there, other missions and organisations planning to come would be encouraged, knowing there would be air transport for their needs. The Mongolian government and the Ministries of Industry, Mining and Agriculture were also potential users. The Minister of Health said he hoped MAF could come into the country and support his work. MAF plans to do just that. The Madagascar programme had been our first step outside Africa. The Mongolian venture would take us 6,000 miles away. MAF Europe's new strategic plan had already envisaged such possibilities. All over the world, the different MAF groups have reached the remotest places. They've given wings to those who bring help and hope. But let's ask again, what happens when missions and MAF leave? When there's war or oppression? When pain and persecution strike? When help cannot come? What will happen to those whose lives have been transformed? To those given new hope by God? Will they survive? Will what's been done be worthwhile? Will anything be left? That's what my next chapter is all about.